Hi, I'm James Hamilton from Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, and today I'm going to help you sort through the BS out there so you can find the workbench that's right for you. BS stands for Buttersticks, by the way. This is a family show. A workbench is a significant expense. You don't want to be peer pressured into the wrong one and end up regretting it for the next 20 years because it isn't right for the sort of work you do in your shop. So here's what we're going to do. As a guy who works with both power and hand tools, I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of the workbench features professionals have favored for generations, and I'll tell you how they may or may not work for both hand tool and power tool woodworking. Then you can take that knowledge and use it to buy or build a bench that's right for you. First, let's clear up a misconception about what a workbench actually is. If you think a bench is just a flat surface you work on, you're missing the whole point. That's an assembly table. A workbench is a work-holding device, the biggest woodworking jig and arguably most important tool in your shop. You can lay a piece of wood on any surface, but a workbench is equipped with devices to hold it for you so you can work on all three types of surfaces. That's right, every workpiece has three types of surfaces: faces, edges, and ends. It doesn't matter if you work primarily with power tools or hand tools, you must have a way to securely hold your workpiece so you can safely and accurately work on any or all of those surfaces. Let's start with the vices. Every good woodworking bench needs at least one. When it's positioned on the face, like this one, it's called a face vise. This is the workhorse of the workbench. It's responsible for 90% of the work holding in one way or another, so it must be well made. If you're building a bench, you may end up spending more on this vise than in all the other materials and hardware on the bench itself. And if you're buying a bench, the quality of this vise should be among the first things you look at. You don't want a little spindly thing. Look at the threads on this one. That's not a standard thread. These are heavy enough to exert a tremendous amount of clamping pressure without deforming. And the low number of threads per inch make it possible to open and close the vise without a billion turns of the handle. Some vices have quick release mechanisms, so they open and close fast. I like that idea, but the ones I've used are kind of fiddly. Sometimes the mechanism won't engage, sometimes it won't disengage. Personally, I like to keep things simple, so I wouldn't say that a quick release is an essential feature as long as the threads are coarse. You'll also notice the heavy steel tracking bars in this vise. That's to keep the jaw or the chop parallel to the front edge of the bench top. I don't care if you're a hand or power tool guy, the time will come when you'll have to clamp something in one end of the vise. When you do this, a cheap vise with spindly guide bars is going to rack. The jaws will close more on the side without the workpiece than the side with it, and you're going to lose the gripping power where you need it. The manufacturer is going to tell you that you're supposed to place shims on the empty side to keep the jaw parallel. I say just get a good vise with a heavy-duty tracking mechanism and you won't have to deal with that hassle. A little racking can't be avoided entirely because the screw exerts a tremendous amount of force on one side, but a good vise should remain almost perfectly parallel and keep the workpiece secure without shims. Another problem with a lot of woodworking vices is they're too narrow, which limits their usefulness in a lot of ways, especially when working on the edge of long stock. You can put a long wooden chop or jaw on a narrow vise, but that's going to work as a lever and exacerbate the racking issues. Again, it's better to get a big, robust face vise to begin with. Some people say they prefer leg vices. That's an old style vise that requires bending over and adjusting a pin near the floor, a proposition that a guy like me finds less than convenient. I've had a couple. There's one stored in my shed right now, and it's likely to stay there forever. To me, the only real benefit is the screw is so low that you have lots of room to hold a drawer side for dovetailing. But I can do that with no problem on the end of my face vise. Overall, I find leg vices to be a pain to use and too narrow for a lot of tasks. Finally, let's briefly touch on vise position. There's a reason most face vices are on the left side of the bench. That's the most comfortable position for hand planing if you're right-handed. If you're left-handed, you should move the vise to the right side of the bench. Even if you never use a hand plane, I still suggest you follow these traditional vise placement rules because a vise in the center of the bench is going to get in the way when you're not using it. And there are a lot of other work holding benefits to these positions that we'll discuss later. A lot of benches also have a second vise on the end. End vices are very handy, as we'll discuss shortly, but you're unlikely to use it as much as the face vise. At least that's been my experience. So spend the money on the face vise first. Then you can add an end vise later. You can even get a less robust end vise if you need to save some cash, since it's not going to be the workhorse that the face vise is. Have you ever wondered why some benches have holes in the top like a big slab of Swiss cheese? They're called dog holes, and they're a traditional woodworking bench feature that I think are still essential for both power tool and hand tool woodworking. Typically, a bench will have two sets of rows. You'll have a set that runs the length of the bench and a set that runs across the bench. Both rows align with holes on each end of your vise chops. You place pegs or bench dogs in these holes and use the vice's clamping action to pinch the workpiece and hold it securely. This is useful for hand planing, but also for power tool tasks like sanding or routing, because you can access the entire surface from edge to edge without clamps getting in the way. Having a nice wide chop on your vise also makes it possible to space these rows further apart and accommodate wider panels more securely. Most of the time, I use the face vise for that kind of surface clamping, but larger, longer workpieces are better accommodated with the end vise. Speaking of clamping options, there's another way these holes can be used to secure your work. This is called a holdfast, and it can be used to clamp all sorts of things down using these same holes as the bench dogs. This is a modern version. A traditional holdfast looks more like this one. They're nice and long, so they can be used to clamp large objects, even entire pieces of furniture, to the bench top for work and repairs. And the way they work is really ingenious. The shaft is just slightly smaller than the holes in the top of your bench. When you hit the top with a hammer, it wedges the shaft in the hole, and your workpiece isn't going anywhere until you hit it on the back with a hammer, and that releases the holdfast. The downside of this traditional design is if I'm not clamping something really big or really thick, this shaft is going to stick out a long way beneath my bench top. And I have a tool cabinet down there. That makes it impossible to use this holdfast with standard 3/4 inch workpieces. So I prefer the modern design that only goes a few inches into the bench top, and then the hooked part rises up and down to accommodate different thicknesses and clamping jobs. You also don't need a hammer for this one. You just give the handle a twist. This is made for a 1-inch dog hole, but I've seen similar versions for benches with smaller 3/4 inch holes. Holdfasts are faster and less cumbersome than clamps, and they can be put in places clamps can't. You can bore a hole anywhere in this bench top that you need it, but I find that the holes that came in mine are perfectly adequate. The holes also come in handy for other odd jobs, like running a nail or a dowel all the way through a workpiece without going into your workbench. You'd be surprised how you'll use them. There's even accessories designed to go with them, like this anvil plate. I don't care if you work with power tools or hand tools, you need to secure your work for sawing, sanding, routing, whatever. But I still prefer bench dogs and holdfasts and a traditional workbench. A lot of well-meaning folks put a lot of time and money into a workbench without realizing they blew it from the moment they designed the undercarriage. See how the legs of my bench are flush with the front edge of the top? This is done intentionally so the face of the bench can become a work-holding surface just like the top. By slipping a holdfast into a hole on the leg, you can use your vise to clamp large workpieces for edge work. Imagine edge banding a plywood panel or routing a hinge mortise on a door. If your legs are set back so that the top has an overhang on the front, you can't do this, and someday you'll kick yourself over it. Of course, this feature will only work if your vise is mounted properly as well. The outer jaw should close flat against the edge of the bench top. I see a lot of benches with vices mounted the wrong way. They have inner jaws that set proud of this apron. These folks don't know that they're limiting what their bench can do. This vise here has no inner jaw. If it did, I would have to put a mortise or a slot in the lamination process so that it can be set back behind the front apron. Another way modern benches fall short is they're too light. A 3/4 inch plywood top on some 2x4 legs aren't going to do the job. A workbench should be big and strong and heavy. If you're sawing or chopping on something, you don't want your bench moving around or worse yet, racking on you. You want a thick top and beefy legs and as much weight as possible. Mine's about 300 pounds without the tools in the cabinet. And a lot of the bench's bulk is right here in the top. A bench top should be heavy, it should be durable, and it should be flat. This is where some woodworkers get into endless debates. Some folks say a beat up chunk of plywood that sags in the middle is perfectly fine because after all, it's a workbench, not a piece of furniture. Others get out their joiner plane and flatten their bench top like a lapping plate every weekend. I say try assembling a drawer or a frame or some other project on a nice flat bench top once and you will never go back. Having that reliable reference surface is a godsend. That doesn't mean I get out the feeler gauges and check my top for flatness every day, but it does mean I want a thick top, at least 3 inches of stable hardwood. Anything thinner will sag and you'll have to reflatten it all the time. A thick top is also a dense top, and you'll appreciate that when you're chopping a mortise or assembling joinery with a mallet. Not everyone likes tool cabinets beneath their benches, but I do. Not only is it handy for storage, but it greatly strengthens the bench's frame, and all that extra weight makes the bench itself heavier. Fully loaded, this thing must tip the scale at 1/4 ton. It's like piling cement blocks on the base, which is what some people do without tool cabinets when they realize that their bench needs more weight. I also find a tool cabinet forces me to be more organized instead of piling junk in the open space that would otherwise be beneath my bench. But here is the downside. It prevents me from using traditional holdfasts like this one. If I use this to clamp down 3/4 inch work, the bulk of the shaft is going to protrude beneath my bench top. I do have some space down there, which I highly recommend a shelf of some kind so that you can store mallets and holdfasts and other things you reach for frequently, but not enough to keep this from bottoming out on the cabinet. So I have to use the more traditional style holdfasts like this one that don't extend below the bench top. While I like tool cabinets, I dislike tool trays. Some traditional benches have them, and I find that they're a great place to collect junk and wood shavings. They also take up valuable workspace on the bench top. Most people I know who have tool trays on their benches wish that they didn't. I would much rather have a wall-mounted tool rack either above the bench or on a wall behind it with the most used tools within easy reach. Whether you work mostly with power tools or hand tools, your workbench should have certain essential features. It should be well built from solid, stable wood. The legs should be flush with the front of the bench top and the vise should close flat against it. The vise should be properly located and of the best quality you can find. It should be nice and wide, easy to open and close, and strong enough to resist racking. A tail vise is a handy addition, but secondary to the face vise. You should have plenty of dog holes in the top and in the legs for a wide range of work holding options. The top should be at least 3 inches thick and nice and flat, and I recommend tool storage beneath but no tool tray on top. To me, that's the perfect hybrid workbench, suited to power tool and hand tool use. You can build that bench, incorporating some or all of these features if you see fit, or you can buy one like mine. It's all ready to go, so you can get to woodworking. The point is, don't let people tell you that traditional workbench features are obsolete in a modern workshop, or that you need whatever bench style is trendy at the moment. Buy or build what makes sense to you. For more great tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker, check out Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. You can read and subscribe for free at stumpynubs.com.